Dear colleagues, dear family, friends, students, and anyone who came here to attend this lecture, I'm deeply honored to be entrusted by the University of Zurich this responsibility of a professorship and to be able to speak to all of you today about some insights into my research. Given this background, though, I would like to start. It's important to celebrate this taking up of this new prestigious position, but I think it's impossible to do this without saying thank you to everyone who accompanied me during this long period, this long path that led to today. So let me thank first and foremost, I would like to thank my wife, Helga Margaret, who I met 20 years ago and stuck with me throughout this entire time. I'm deeply grateful to her for her love, patience, and unconditional support along the many years, and for moving here to Switzerland with me. I'm proud of you, and I love you. I would like to thank my children, Theodore, Benedict, and Sylvia, who make me proud every day, and who I'm thankful for their good spirits in the transition to a new country, which is really not easy. Right? I understand that. I would like to thank my mother, Regula, and my father, Ivo, for their support and unconditional love. My mother is here today. I'm sure my father, who passed many years ago, would have been very proud to be here as well today. I'd like to thank my brother, Gregor, who is here, and my sister, Claudia, who lives in Denmark and couldn't be here, my goddaughter, Ella, who is here as well, for their support and companionship throughout the years. And of course, I'm very grateful to all my new colleagues, my academic and non-academic staff at the Department of Economics and beyond, for welcoming me to this new position, to this new place warmly here in Zurich. I thank the University of Zurich, the UBS Center, for supporting me, of course. And I would also like to thank, they're not here today, but my advisors. They've been very crucial and impactful for the research I'm doing today. That's Per Korsell, who was my PhD advisor in Stockholm, as well as my co-author and mentor, Alan Kruger from Princeton University, who both inspired my research very deeply, that I've been doing since I received my PhD in 2011. And finally, my co-authors, very important. Some of them are here today. It's a great joy to work with you. The students I interact with, the research assistants, some of you are here as well today. So I interact with you on an everyday basis. It's really thanks to you that this job is interesting and that this job is rewarding. So, having said so much about this, I would like to talk about my research, or a little bit, give you a little bit of a glance of what I'm doing on a day-to-day basis. Okay, so if I explain to my family, sometimes it's hard to explain what I do on an everyday basis, so I'm happy to be able to share that. So today I want to talk about long-term unemployment, which is really one of the fundamental themes of my research. And I just wanted to show you a few pictures. Okay? So here this shows what's the share of unemployed workers that are long-term unemployed in OECD countries. So what is a long-term unemployed person? A long-term unemployed person is a person that's been unemployed out of work for over 6 months. Okay? And so you see there is quite a bit of variation across countries in the share of long-term unemployed across countries. Switzerland actually is quite high, with over 50%. Just want to point out also Belgium is relatively high because I'm going to show you some research later on that. I also have done research on the United States, which is on the very other side of the spectrum of the share of long-term unemployed, as well as Sweden actually also has a relatively low share of long-term unemployed. Okay? So why do people become long-term unemployed? In some sense, in an accounting sense, it's a very easy question because you become long-term unemployed if you don't find a job. Okay? So the reverse side of this picture is here. Okay? So here I look at, for the same countries, I look at what is the probability or the fraction of people that find a job within the first 6 months of their unemployment spell. Okay? So if you're unemployed, you lost your job, how long or what's the probability that you find a job? So you find countries like Belgium and Switzerland, that is relatively low, and so that's why they have a high share of long-term unemployed workers. Whereas in countries like the United States, is actually quite high. Okay, so within 6 months, most people actually do find jobs, and that's why they don't become long-term unemployed. What I want to show you next is, well, you can also look at how likely is it that a long-term unemployed person finds a job. So once you're long-term unemployed, how long or how likely it is that you find a job within the next 6 months. And the striking part of this picture is that this is much lower for the long-term unemployed compared to the short-term unemployed. Okay? So in every single country of these OECD countries, the long-term unemployed are much less likely to find a job in the following 6 months after they became long-term unemployed. Okay? So from month 1 to 6, people are relatively fast to find jobs, but if for some reason you fail to find a job, it seems like it's much less likely to find a job in the next 6 months or even after that. Okay? So I could also look at 12, 18 months and so on, and it becomes lower and lower. Okay? So this is a really fundamental feature of long-term unemployment. The long-term unemployed workers don't find jobs, seem to have a hard time of finding jobs. That also has created a lot of policy discussions. So what should we do about this? Okay, being long-term unemployed is not a desirable thing. Employment agencies who try to help people find jobs have identified this as a big problem. Okay? And they have started doing what I would call statistical profiling of long-term unemployed workers. One approach is just basically target so you wait until somebody is long-term unemployed, and then you apply policies like job search counseling and job training and so on to them to help them find jobs, to help them to find better jobs. Another approach is to really do statistical profiling where you try to predict, does a person actually become long-term unemployed, okay, from the outset, and apply those policies from the outset when a person has become unemployed first. Okay? So if I can predict somebody will become long-term unemployed, why wait until they are long-term unemployed if you actually can target these policies to these workers from the start? Okay? So here's just a recent survey from the OECD, which lists countries that do this kind of targeting. There's also Belgium is in there, I'm going to talk about this later, as well as Sweden. And so there's a mix of different approaches. Some, they target just the long-term unemployed once they actually are long-term unemployed, whereas other countries, they have statistical profiling models where they try to identify the people that are most likely to become long-term unemployed, especially. So that's something that's, for example, the case in Belgium. Okay? So let me kind of conclude with these observations before getting into my research. So first of all, tackling the issue of long-term unemployment is really at the forefront of labor market policy. It seems it's perceived as a big problem. First, because the long-term unemployed are just very unlikely to find jobs. Okay? But also, if you look at further outcomes, which I haven't shown you here, long-term unemployed workers, they usually get also worse jobs in terms of wages, not just only in terms of wages, but also in terms of job stability. Okay? So if you get a job, have been out of job for a long time, the new job that you find is worse both in terms of wages as well as stability of that job. This is often heightened at times of recessions. Okay? So long-term unemployment becomes a particular bad issue in bad economic times when it is just very hard to find a job. Right? So these issues have been, as I've already mentioned, at the forefront of labor market policies. How should you set unemployment benefits? How should you target job search counseling policies? Or how should you design job training programs and target these programs? So that's kind of the broad, the setting of where I've been doing my research in recent years, at least one of the themes. What I wanted to do today is to try to shed light on two questions. The first question is, why do unemployed workers become long-term unemployed? Okay? What are the fundamental reasons why some unemployed workers become long-term unemployed? And I've done a lot of research on this topic, so I'm going to show you quite a bit of research on that. And then I'm going to ask a follow-up question. Okay? Should labor market policy target certain types of unemployed workers? Should it target the long-term unemployed? There, it's a little bit more speculative. Here, I'm going to just show you some very recent research that actually still is sort of in the process. So it's a bit more speculative, okay? But I'm going to try to give you a more definitive answer of what I think are the sources of long-term unemployment. So let me go to this first question. Okay? Why do unemployed workers become long-term unemployed? And to kind of guide this discussion, I want to tell you that there's basically two main theories or two main ways we can think about long-term unemployment. The first view, and it's very much consistent with this picture I've shown you in the beginning, is that long-term unemployment is a trap. Okay? Once you are long-term unemployed, it's very hard to escape this state of the world. Okay? So you have, for some reason, you were just unlucky, you become long-term unemployed, then your job finding rate is very low, and you just stay long-term unemployed forever. Okay? It's very hard to get back into the labor market. And I would say that's probably more the traditional interpretation of long-term unemployment. There is, however, another view of long-term unemployment which says, well, no, we should think about the long-term unemployed in a different way. We should think about the long-term unemployed per se. It's not a trap, so basically those who are long-term unemployed, those who become long-term unemployed, are just very different people. These people are very different in terms of their job-finding prospects, in terms of their attachment to the labor force. Very different from those who find jobs early on. Right? Let me elaborate on this distinction. Okay? So view one, again. So view one, long-term unemployment is a trap. There's many mechanisms which fit into that broad view. One thing I can think of is, for example, skill deterioration. Okay? So during the process of unemployment, you fail to find a job. Over time, if you've been unemployed for too long, you forget how to do the job that you used to do. Therefore, the companies are less willing to hire you over time. Okay? This could also be more of a psychological issue. Okay? If you become unemployed, it's a difficult situation, you fail to find a job, people get discouraged over time if they don't get offers or if they get bad offers. So they update their views about how good they are, and as a consequence, they search less, and because they search less, they're less likely to get offers and to escape long-term unemployment. Okay? So that's another view. It could also be not because of something the workers are doing, but because of something the firms are doing. Firms might discriminate explicitly against the long-term unemployed because, true or not, they may think that the long-term unemployed, they're somehow different. They're maybe not as productive, or they're not as good colleagues, or not as good workers as those that we can hire early on. So even if this is not true, this would lead to this kind of phenomenon that the longer you're unemployed, the less likely you are to find a job because firms don't want to hire you anymore. It could also be that somehow the job search process through other reasons could change over the spell of unemployment. So what's very important to find a job is the network that you have access to. Okay? What really leads to access to jobs is the professional networks through your former coworkers, friends, and so on. So maybe you lose those networks over time, and that gives you less access to jobs over time. So all these mechanisms have in common that the longer a person remains unemployed, the less likely this person is to find a job. Okay? So my probability of finding a job early on is high, but the longer I'm unemployed, maybe I get discouraged, maybe the firms don't want to hire me anymore, the less likely I am to find a job. And this is, in the technical jargon, referred to as duration dependence. Okay? My job finding probability becomes lower and lower over the spell of unemployment. In this view, it might be a good idea to target with unemployment policies those who actually become long-term unemployed. Okay? So those are the ones that may be discouraged or not getting hired by firms because they're perceived for some reason as not as productive. So we want to help and target these workers. Okay? That's view one. View two is that no, long-term unemployment is not a trap. The long-term unemployed are just very different people, very different types. And there we can think about also similar mechanisms, but not along the dimension of how long have you been unemployed, but just because people are different. Okay? So people may have different skills. Some skills are in demand, other skills are not in demand. Okay? So the firms are just going to hire the workers that are in demand. Different search behavior. Okay? So some workers, they're just more motivated, others are less motivated. Some workers, they may perceive that the return to job search is very high, and that's why they search a lot. Others think, no, if I search a lot, I'm still not getting a job. Yeah? So it can be both because of the actual and perceived returns to job search that we have different search behavior between different types of unemployed workers. It could be explicit employer discrimination, and now I don't think about the dimension of long-term unemployed versus short-term unemployed. Now think about employer discrimination along other dimensions. Yeah? So things like you could think about race, gender, and so on, but maybe also unobservable dimensions. Or different networks. Some workers, they just have a broad network. They're very sociable. They connect to a lot of people. They have better access to jobs than others. So they're just more likely to find jobs than others. So again, in my research, I have also tried to shed light on these different mechanisms, but here I want to make a broader point. Okay? So when we kind of discriminate more between view one and view two, what is the implication of view two? Okay? The implication of view two is that people, they have, if you look at a specific person, if you observe their probability of finding a job over the spell of unemployment, it's constant. Okay? But people differ very much in the likelihood of finding a job, which then ultimately leads to what is called in the literature a selection, is that the high types, those who find a job quickly, they don't stay unemployed, but only the low types, those who find jobs slowly, they stay unemployed. So over time, the average job finding rate is going to be declining. According to this approach, if you can somehow know who are these bad and who are these good types, then it would be maybe a good idea to target those who are at risk of long-term unemployment from the onset of unemployment. Yeah, so you can identify a person, I know you are likely to not find a job, I'm going to help you find a job from the beginning of the unemployment spell. Okay. Now, why is this such a hard question? Why is this not an easy question to solve? No, actually, it's been a very hard question to solve. And the main reason why we find it difficult to resolve this question between these two views is that in a typical data set, so we have data on unemployed workers, we observe workers being unemployed only once. Yeah? And we don't observe the probability of finding a job, but we only observe whether a person found a job or not. Okay? So if I'm unemployed, I find a job quickly, or let's say I find a job very slowly, I cannot distinguish, is it because of bad luck, or is it because I'm just a very different person? I have a very low probability of finding a job. Okay? Because I only see you once, you maybe find a job quickly, even if you're sort of a low type or the other way around. Okay? Let me illustrate this also in terms of in an illustrative graph. Okay? So I'm going to show you here what are the implications of these views when we look at what is the job finding rate, the probability of the probability of finding a job that we observe in the data. Okay? So according to view one, the probability of finding a job is the same for everyone when they start an unemployment spell. But the longer they're unemployed, they might get discouraged, they might face discrimination by employers, but the lower is going to be the job finding rate. Okay? And that's also what we're going to observe, because even though this is going to be declining, the individual probability of finding a job is going to be equal to the average probability of finding a job at each duration of unemployment. Okay? So here on the x-axis, we have the duration of unemployment. On the y-axis, we have the probability of finding a job. And this basically just illustrates what we typically see in the data. Yes, the probability of finding a job seems to be declining. Okay? Let me go to view 2. Okay? So view 2 is that now, if I look at a specific individual, so let's say there's 2 types of unemployed workers. Let's say there's a type 1, let's call it the high type. The high type has a high probability of finding a job throughout the spell. Okay? It's just constant. So I'm always likely to find a job, even if I'm long-term unemployed. And the low type is a type of unemployed worker who has a low probability of finding a job. So this is for a specific individual. Problem is that we don't observe this. I don't observe the probability at each moment of the unemployment spell. Okay? But one thing we know, if you are a high type, and this is why I have these dashed lines, if you're likely to find a job, then it's also likely that the further we're down to, the further we are here to the right, the less likely you are in the sample. Okay? You select out of the sample through this process of selection. That means if I look at the average probability between these 2 types, well, in the beginning it's roughly in the middle, okay? Because we have, let's say, equal proportions of these types. But then over time, with duration of unemployment, there's more and more of the low types in the pool of unemployed, so the average probability is going to be declining. Okay? So in some sense, what I would like to say is that these 2 views are observationally equivalent. They look exactly the same. So what I observe in the data is the black line and not the red line. And the line looks the same in view 1 as in view 2. Okay, so that's kind of illustrating why is it so hard to distinguish between these 2 views. Now let me get to, well, how can we actually address this? And this is where some of my research has come in. So obviously, one way to address this is try to see, well, how are people different in terms of their job finding among observables? Okay? If I observe 2 types of workers, let's say people on the right-hand side of this room and the left-hand side, maybe that would be one thing. Typically, we think more about age or education, all these things. Can this predict the job finding rates? And if yes, this will tell us how different people are along this dimension. Okay? This has been tried many times, and the problem with this is that this approach, yes, maybe it works, but it's limited by the richness of the data. Okay? So if you have data that's not so good, or if the data is only age and education, maybe this is not good enough. This will not tell you enough about the differences in job seekers, probability of finding a job. And in fact, it is true that people surprisingly don't differ so much in their job finding rate along the education dimension, which is something that we often observe in survey data. Okay? So high educated and low educated workers, they don't differ so much in terms of their job finding rates. Okay? So that's the challenge with this approach 1, though it's been tried, and we've tried to push the research frontier in this. The other one is to use data on 2 or more unemployment spells. Okay? So basically, before what I told you is that typically we only observe 1 unemployment spell per person. But let's say you have multiple unemployment spells per person, then what you can do, you can see, well, how does the length of these spells, so if I'm unemployed for a long time in the first spell, and then 30 years later, again, I'm unemployed for a long time, it's in all likelihood, I may be a sort of a bad type, okay, or a low type, I'm just less likely to find jobs. Okay? So the correlation of the length of 2 unemployment spells tells us something about how likely I am to find a job, or what kind of type that I am. Yeah? Now, there's 2 problems with this. This first problem is that many people don't have 2 unemployment spells. Okay? So even if you have all the data that there is on unemployed workers in Switzerland, you would have to observe them over a very long period of time, and often people have even no unemployment spell. Okay, but I'm sure many in this room have had never an unemployment spell. It's rather uncommon among professors. But even one unemployment spell is a very common thing and not two. Okay, so that's one issue. Another issue is that, yeah, well, if I observe you once when you're 20 and once when you're 50, you may have become a different person. Okay, so you may change your type over the life cycle. So this approach cannot really deal with this. But there's still a way forward. Okay, so I still, in my research, try to use both of these approaches to make progress on this question of discriminating between these two views of long-term unemployment. So let me talk a little bit about my research after this long introduction. Yeah, I think I should speed up a bit. How can we distinguish between these two views? First paper I wanted to talk about is this paper with Johannes Binevin and Georgia Topa, Job Seekers' Perceptions and Employment Prospects. So again, as I mentioned before, traditionally it has been very difficult to predict whether people differ in their job finding prospects. What the idea was in this project was very simple. Okay? Let's go out and ask people, what do they think? What are the chances of finding a job? Okay? So to elicit people's views about how likely they think they are to find a job. So that we used two surveys, one of them an existing one, this is for the US. The question there is, what do you think is the % chance that within the coming 3 months, you will find a job that you will accept, considering the pay and type of work? Okay? So the % chance, what is the probability that you will find a job? First finding, wide differences in this reported probability. Okay? Some people, and this is only unemployed workers, some unemployed workers think that they're very unlikely. So that would be those this is a density, so it's showing you kind of how many people. So a lot of people, a lot of mass to the left. Some people think they're very unlikely to find jobs, and then some are very likely to think they're very likely to find jobs. Yeah? There's some bunching at 50% because some people always say 50%. So overall, you may have also some concerns. Well, what do people say? They just say a random number? No. The answer is no, because the advantage of the survey that we had was that it was not only what is called a cross-sectional comparison, we also followed up 3 months later. Did these people actually find a job? Okay? So what this graph shows you, it bins these unemployed workers into 10 bins based on what they said, what is their likelihood, and then we looked at the outcomes. So if you look at to the left, those who said that their chance of finding a job was between 0 and 0.1, between 0 and 10%. Their actual job finding was 15%. Okay, not quite accurate, but then there's a very strong positive slope. Okay? If you go to people who said their chance of finding a job was between 0.9 and 1, their probability of finding a job, or the actual probability of finding a job, their outcome, which is shown on the y-axis, was 75%. Okay? So while it is not perfect, it has very, very strong predictive power for actual job finding, suggesting that there is a lot of differences of types of unemployed workers. In addition, we are also able to track their reported probability of finding a job the longer they're unemployed. Okay? Because now we observe it. We observe the reported probability. We don't observe the actual, but we observe what they think is the case. And so this says time since the first interview, okay, because we didn't catch everybody right at the beginning of the unemployment spell, but this basically looks at, did, for a given person, the probability change over the spell? And the answer is no. Okay? So basically it's completely flat. We also replicated this finding in another survey where it's even slightly upward moving. So people don't seem to update their perceived chances of finding a job over the spell of unemployment. Again, consistent with view 2 of unemployment, that there's different types, and for a given type, it's basically flat. Okay? So that's first paper I wanted to talk about. Second paper I wanted to talk about is again with my co-author, Johannes Binevin. That's a paper that was recently accepted. The nature of long-term unemployment. Again, the starting point was the same. It's hard to predict people's chances of finding a job. But the ideas that we developed in this project was not based on survey data, but based on very rich administrative data on unemployed workers. So basically, use administrative data to predict job finding using machine learning techniques, trying to see how well can we do when we have a little bit more than just education. Yeah? And we combine this with multiple spell data. Yeah? We actually also develop in this paper this multiple spell approach, and ultimately the idea was to combine the two approaches. Okay? Now, this was actually the first paper I've written with Swedish data, even though I did my PhD in Sweden in 2011. It took a long time to get there. Swedish data is amazing because it has a lot of richness. So the data we use all unemployment spells for Sweden between 1992 and 2014, plus data on the typical characteristics you have: age, education, gender, industry, region, employment histories, wage histories, disability insurance histories, unemployment histories, employment insurance histories. We have information on the last firm that you were employed. We have information on savings, financial assets, and even IQ scores, only for Mando, from military enlistment. Okay? So what we do in this paper, we basically throw all this into a machine learning model and see how well can we do to predict job finding, how well can we do to predict long-term unemployment. And we do actually quite well. Okay? So this shows you again what the outcome of this prediction model. Okay? So using all these tools, which I don't want to get into, to predict a 6-month job finding probability at the start of the spell. So some people are very likely to find a job within 6 months, and some people are actually quite unlikely to find a job within 6 months. Okay? So it's not quite uniform like the reported probability, but here, this is actual differences. Okay? So if anything, the differences may be even wider, but not smaller. Okay? This is adjusted for all kinds of measurement error. We can also then use this predicted probability of finding a job to study this issue of what I would call selection directly. Okay? What I'm showing you here, the orange line, again, is what we typically observe. Okay? So the longer a person is unemployed, the less likely they are to find jobs. Okay? Now, the blue line is trying to show you the importance of selection. Okay? What we do there is that we fix each type at the beginning. So based on the prediction model, we're telling you, okay, person A has a 60% probability of finding a job, and now we're just changing the composition of the sample as you remain unemployed. Okay? So further down here, we just have fewer and fewer of the high types. And so that blue line is very close to the orange line, which basically tells you that selection is very important. Okay? Selection is very important. The high types just they find jobs early on and don't become long-term unemployed. Okay? Of course, it doesn't explain everything. Okay? So it explains a large share of the decline of job finding, but not everything. And so in this paper, without showing you the technical details, we also emphasize the strong complementary value between this approach of predicting job finding with observable characteristics and the approach 2, which is to use data multiple spells. Okay? We can actually evaluate within the same sample these different the values of these two approaches. Okay? So using approach 2, we can evaluate approach 1, okay? And we find approach 1 is not perfect. Okay? What I've shown you before, yes, there's something missing here. It doesn't explain everything. And we show that, yes, predicting job finding misses a substantial part of differences between types that we can't really observe, but that we can identify with this multiple spell approach. Similarly, with approach 2, okay, so we also implemented approach 2, and we find, yes, the two spells typically correlate very strongly, suggesting there is a lot of differences between unemployed workers, but it also misses observable differences. First, because this is limited to a sample with 2 spells, versus approach 1 we can implement with a sample of 1 spell. And also because people change their type over the life cycle, yeah, which is also an important reason why this multiple spell approach is not perfect. And so ultimately what we show in this paper is how to combine the two approaches and come up with an estimate of how much of the decline of job finding over the spell is driven by view 1 versus view 2. Okay? And what we're showing in this paper is that 88% of the decline is driven by view 2, which is that the unemployed, they just differ very strongly in their probability of finding a job. So those who end up long-term unemployed, they're just very different people. So overall, let me summarize. Just have a few minutes left. I think my research on this topic suggests that there's quite strong evidence in favor of this view 2, that the long-term unemployed, they are very different. And long-term unemployment is not so much a trap, okay? At least not a big trap. That's the evidence from these two papers. That raises the question that I asked in the beginning. If we can predict who becomes long-term unemployed, should we target those people from the beginning? And so let me show you some very recent research that's fresh off the press on this issue. And so should labor market policy target the long-term, those at risk of long-term unemployment? But a very related question is obviously we want to target those who benefit the most from a policy. Okay? So that's, in a broad sense, I think we can all agree to that. But a very important question now is, well, should we really target these long-term unemployed, those who are at risk of long-term unemployment? Or maybe those at risk of long-term unemployment, they respond very differently to these targeted interventions. Okay? So if you give job search advice to the long-term unemployed, or those at risk of long-term unemployment, do they actually respond in a positive way? That's kind of the question we wanted to ask. Do they differ in the way that they respond to these typical policies? Again, this is work in progress. So again, what we do here, this is working with Belgium data in Flanders, where we estimate the employment effects of assigning unemployed workers to case workers who then give them job search advice, and see how these effects differ among different types of unemployed workers. Okay? I'm going to just go ahead a little bit. So yeah, well, I should say that in Belgium, they actually use this, they have a prediction model where they try to predict long-term unemployment. Okay? So caseworkers in Belgium, they provide this job search advice. In general, job seekers, so it's Flanders, so you should be careful not to upset my co-author, who are not self-reliant are assigned to caseworkers in a regional employment office. Okay? So one specific feature, though, is that if it has been less than 6 months since you were assigned to this, since you've been unemployed last, and you had a caseworker in your previous unemployment spell, then you're reassigned to the previous caseworker. Okay? So our empirical strategy is what we call in the literature regression discontinuity design. So we basically compare the contact with caseworkers between those who just had a spell with just below or above 6 months, and then we compare employment outcomes along the same dimension, and then the ratio of the two, speaking loosely here, should give you the effect of caseworkers on days employed. Okay? So it should tell you how much did the advice given by these caseworkers actually help the unemployed. So this shows you just sort of the treatment. Okay? So basically this tells you how long has it been since your previous unemployment spell. So this is the assignment to these caseworkers. So there is a notable difference in the assignment. Okay? So those just below are much more likely to get this advice. To those above this 180 days since the last spell are much less likely to get assigned to this spell, to assign to a caseworker. Now, if we look at days worked within 4 weeks of the start of the spell, and we can also look at other horizons, we see a small difference in employment. Okay? So those who are below and have been more likely to get caseworker contact, they're more likely to find jobs. And so the effect is about 0.58 days or if we divide one versus the other, then the effect is about 4 days. Okay? So that's how we estimate the effect of caseworkers. Now, the key thing is, what I wanted to do here is to show you heterogeneity. Okay? Do people that are at risk of becoming long-term unemployed more or less responsive to these policies? Now here, this is what I show you. Okay? I show you for a subsample. So here on the x-axis, we have the predicted probability of finding a job within 6 months, which is the risk score that this employment agency uses also for some other policies. So it's about, so the estimated effect is about 4 days, similar to the average effect. Okay? Now, if I look at those who are most at risk of becoming long-term unemployed, these are those who have a very low predicted job finding probability, the estimated effect is actually 0. Right? So those who are typically targeted actually don't seem to respond to this caseworker context, to this job search counseling, and those who are most likely to find a job, they seem to benefit the most. So it's very counterintuitive, but I think this raises some questions about targeting these unemployment policies. Okay? So let me just conclude here. My research shows that unemployment is not a trap. Instead, I think I would argue strongly in favor of view 2, that the unemployed are just very, very different people. This does create a potential role for targeting, but one has to be careful with this targeting, because it seems like, at least in our context, that the long-term unemployed, those at risk of long-term unemployment, seem not to respond to these policies the way we would like them to respond. Okay? Though there are substantial differences in targeting, not just along this dimension. So another source of statistical profiling would be actually target not people in terms of their predicted risk of becoming long-term unemployed, but in terms of how do you respond to these policies. Okay? People that are predicted positive to respond positively to these policies, maybe we should consider targeting those. Thank you for listening to me. It was a great pleasure.